In the story of David versus Goliath, the small underdog is able to outsmart and defeat his larger adversary. This is the spirit behind the name Dave. We have built an integrated and fully digital financial services platform. Our strategy is focused on delivering a superior banking experience for anyone living paycheck to paycheck, extracting more than $250 million in revenue in the latest year from this core market that is living paycheck to paycheck. But that is not enough to cover the over $300 million in operating expenses that it takes in order to have this business running. Now, those operating expenses are noticeably lower, more than 10% lower than they were last year. Almost all of that difference is because Dave is spending less on advertising and marketing. More than $20 million less. As an investor, you gotta like that in the latest year, Dave generated money. It wasn't doing that a year ago. This is a very young company, a fintech startup, generating money. But how is it generating money? Dave has squeezed this money out of its business in the latest year through a combination of manipulating its prepaid expenses, its accrued expenses, its accounts payable, reducing how much they're keeping in a piggy bank for legal settlement fees, clawing back member advances, lowering its provision for credit losses, and stock-based compensation. This is a hot fintech startup. There's lots of reasons to be excited. Let's understand what these things are for Dave. We just talked about some accounting terms. Depending on where you're at, maybe it sounded scary, maybe it sounded exciting. The truth is, accounting doesn't tell us whether something is good or bad. It's supposed to be an objective measure. That's why I'm about to find the details, the economics, in the rest of this annual report so we can validate if there's value here, whatever that means for you. We saw that Dave has a lot of ability to shift around its expenses, and we saw a piggy bank for legal settlement fees. What all these things have in common, the common thread between all of them, is the Gramm-leach-bliley Act. GLBA has been around for many years, but is important to understand how this business behaves. This video is intended for educational purposes. Opinions made by me or the Sage Seeds AI are not investment advice. GLBA imposes limitations on financial institutions' disclosure of non-public personal information. It's a data privacy bill in the United States. I believe it was passed last century, right at the end of it. And so it comes from that era of the dot-com boom. And the important part for us is that it requires financial institutions to safeguard, as best as they can, personal member information. For Dave, that means every single person that signs up for a Dave account, every person is a liability because the standards are high when it comes to data privacy. Quick side note, lots of our enthusiasts out there, if you're politically active in the US and you think the data privacy standards could be way higher, I sympathize with you. But just in terms of what it takes to be a financial institution in the States, the standards are relatively high right now. Could they be absolutely higher or lower? I'm not going to get into that. But relatively speaking, financial institutions have more restrictions in the US related to data privacy than in most places right now. Here is a table of other expenses. The background I just pulled out is the whole reason why there is a legal settlement and litigation expenses row here, or at least most of the reason. The change in this litigation expense last year compared to this year was a change of negative 100%. It completely disappeared. Why? Because for the first time ever, now it is its own category, its own account. What does that mean? So I'll tell you one of the main implications in my mind as a financial analyst trying to digest these financial statements. This is the income statement again. We already saw this. This is the total operating expenses. This is the revenue. After you take out these operating expenses, you have the other expenses. And because for the first time ever, this has been removed and made into its separate account, well, just look right here. Legal settlement and litigation expenses, the same exact thing. Last year, this was taking away $6.2 million from the profit margin. This year, that isn't being done at all. In fact, this is not showing up anywhere in the income statement now because of the accounting change, meaning that this net loss doesn't include the expenses for legal settlements, whereas it did last year. And so yes, the net loss is much smaller, but right off the bat, this is just one of the decisions done last year, which is actually part of the explanation for why the net loss is smaller. It's not the full explanation by any stretch. This is only a difference of a few $1 million, but already we're starting to get a sense of where the finance department of this business, Dave, is at right now in this point of time. Let's figure out what more led to this decision so that then we can back up and try to understand what's going on with this company right now in this point of time. Here we have it presented in a different way. Legal settlement and litigation expenses totaled $0 for the year ended 2023, the latest year. See Note 13, Commitments and Contingencies, for more information regarding pending legal actions. That was actually a typo. It's Note 12. If you want to invest in Dave, you do have to think about legal proceedings as ordinary course of business. That's fine. Stouffer's versus Dave Inc. filed in 2020 a class action lawsuit connected to a July 2020 data breach. This is where the Bliley Data Protection Act comes into play. In 2020, the company wrote down in its accounting that it expected to pay $4.1 million related to individual claims arising from this 2020 data breach. After debating it for 3 years, they've paid $3.9 million of those $4.1 million expenses, meaning that there's about $200,000 left in expected expenses. However, all the company can say at this time is that the company plans on settling the remaining expenses in the first quarter of 2024. Well, who cares? Normally, I'd say it doesn't matter that much. In fact, especially for a sort of financial institution, this stuff is totally normal. I mean, I just told you since 1999, this has been part of the reality of having a fintech or a banking company. Anything that puts your customers' data at risk is basically your fault. Doesn't really matter what the details are, and you have to pay out these claims. This is only a couple $1 million, but Dave is in a specific unique situation in which I think this is actually a lot more important than it normally would be. I'm going to explain that situation now. Note 11 of the financial statements, debt facility. I encourage anyone to look into this section if they want the full picture, but I actually think most of it is kind of boring and not interesting. There's just one particular point that I want to draw to our attention, and I'm going to look at it this way. In January 2021, they had a loan facility that helped Dave continue to pay its expenses as it was in startup growth mode, which it still is, by the way. Very common for startups to use this. Just a few months ago in 2023, that debt facility, its main debt facility, went through an evolution which was negotiated way back in 2021. And the timing here is important. When this debt facility was originally created, which you can look up, it's a banking institution called Victory Park Management, blah, blah, blah. But Victory Park Management knew about the 2020 data breach. How do I know that? Well, because they were negotiating this in early 2021, weeks and months after the data breach had leaked and it was clear that Dave was going to be held liable. And so Victory Park Management lent money to Dave with conditions related to this data breach. So what was the evolution just a couple weeks ago? The evolution named the third amendment to the debt facility. Frankly, I'm not going to read this. This is not very well presented, but I am going to give you the 3 main points that I have been able to pull out of this. First point, very important, is that this third amendment is largely a very positive thing for Dave. It is a increase in the trust that Victory Park Management is giving to Dave, rewarding them really. The maximum amount that Dave can borrow from Victory Park increases by $50 million to $150 million. There's an extra $50 million Dave now has access to. And the interest rate, the annual interest rate, decreases from about 6.5% to 5%. These are both rewards. So that's point 1. Points 2 and 3 are potentially negative. I'm not going to say they're negative, but they're sensitive and they're related to the data breach. So this is where it gets crazy. Point 2 is, as part of this loan facility, Dave has to have a minimum amount of cash on its balance sheet. We call that the minimum liquidity threshold. Point 2 is that liquidity threshold, that minimum liquidity threshold, is increasing from $8 million to $15 million. That's $7 million difference, which for a very young company like Dave is a challenge. It's not impossible and it's not unfair, but they're going to have to keep at minimum almost twice as much cash on hand at all times. That's a challenge. And then point 3, this is the one that is most directly connected to the data breach and the outstanding legal fees. We have some covenants, and these are always potentially tricky. We have a covenant that in my mind, they're not saying it explicitly, but in my mind, Victory Park Management included specifically because of the data breach lawsuit. This subpoint 4A, if extraordinary receipts are received by Dave, the borrower, in the aggregate amount in any fiscal year in excess of $250,000. Well, let me tell you right now, Dave has the expectation that it owes $200,000 in 2024, but that is an expectation. The buffer between their expectation of $200,000 and the legal covenant that they've signed with their loan facility of it cannot exceed more than $250,000 is a measly $50,000. And if their legal settlement, which would count as an extraordinary receipt, is greater than $250,000, even by one penny, that triggers the covenant that within 3 business days after the date of that extraordinary receipt, the borrower, aka Dave, will prepay the loans or remit cash proceeds in an aggregate amount equal to 100% of such net cash proceeds. In other words, if the data breach ends up costing anything more than $50,000 and one more than their expectation, Dave will have to immediately pay back all of its loan facility to Victory Park Management. No payment schedule, no installments. Pay us back 100% within 3 business days, or else Dave will be in breach of its loan facility from 2021 and have to effectively enter into bankruptcy. Bankruptcy in this case is where stakeholders like Victory Park Management will get to scrap Dave for parts. Not fun for any startup, much less a financial startup that depends on its reputation as a financial institution. And so this could be very, very bad. And this is where we go back to the Bliley Act, where we go back to the 2020 data breach. It's not that the data breach itself had any real serious consequence. I mean, apologies to the people who were part of the data breach. I hope everything's okay with you and all that. But it really wasn't that big of a data breach. What's really going on here is that Victory Park Management, they're doing a good job on their end. Within months of that data breach happening in 2020, they snuck these covenants in there, which a couple years later are now causing Dave to realize, oh, we should have, maybe they did know and they just had no choice. But basically, this fine print is not very comfortable to go through if you're Dave. They're playing it very, very close. And so what do? Well, going back to the income statement, well, there's several things we got to do to try to improve the situation any way we can. First off, as the financial department, hide this number. At least at minimum, don't make it nearly as obvious. If anything bad were to happen, you don't want to just publicize the number right on the front page like an idiot, really. And so no-brainer decision is make that its own account. You don't have to report it in the income statement. Yes, it makes this income statement lower quality, just straight up. I mean, it's not always the case, but in this case, it's just straight up a lower quality income statement. But when you realize that Victory Park Management is kind of hovering, waiting to see if this legal settlement is going to cause a breach of the covenants of the loan facility, well then yeah, it's a no-brainer. Take it off the front page. At least make it a little bit harder for them to see. Now, way back at the beginning, we also saw that Dave generated cash in the last year for several reasons, but one of the reasons was also their decrease in marketing and advertising. They spent more than $20 million less, if you remember. Now, fortunately for us as an analyst, because it keeps things simple, I believe this is also easily explained by the 2020 data breach. Here we have Dave's very accurate, honestly, it looks like a really good model, but this is their customer acquisition costs since 2020. As you can see is they had one of the lowest acquisition costs in the industry, mainly based on their ability to monetize their proprietary research. I mean, Dave has algorithms that helps them market their, I'm not gonna call them payday loans, but basically payday loans to people very efficiently. Specifically the people who need those payday loans. And this is the core engine of the business of Dave is. You make loans that are perhaps riskier than most financial institutions, but you are very efficient at generating those loans. Well, the 2020 data breach immediately had its customer acquisition cost go from $17 to $25. They don't explicitly say that this was because of the data breach, but I mean, come on. This is not a small change at all. And as far as I can tell, is only explained in this way because of that 2020 data breach and the fact that Dave was in the news back then for negative reasons. Since 2020, they've been fighting to get that customer acquisition cost back down to regular levels. I do mean fighting. Now, for better or worse, it seems like I honestly think people just forgot, and Dave could have done nothing and they would have forgot anyway. But, oh well, the past is the past. Dave spent the last 2 years fighting very hard. And it looks like people just eventually forgot about it. But oh well. It's important to note that this substantial increase in customer acquisition costs made their marketing significantly less efficient. And so for the same reason that they had to take on this loan facility in 2021 with a very mean covenant, putting them under some pressure right now, they also had to lower their marketing. Not because they didn't want to grow. I mean, if it were up to Dave, as far as I can tell, they would increase the marketing because they make money for every marketing dollar. They want that marketing to increase because they're in growth startup mode. But they actually lowered it as a response to the fact that in 2022, it had been 2 years where the customer acquisition cost was in the mid-20s. That is a different world than when it was in the high teens. As a response, they actually had to lower their marketing costs just because they had to face the reality that it looked like, at least for 2 years, their marketing was not efficient as it used to be. Therefore, spend less on marketing. In 2023, the Financial Health Network, which is like a third party, it doesn't matter that much, estimated that approximately 180 million Americans are financially vulnerable or financially coping based on financial health scores. Given these dynamics, Dave estimates that their total addressable market consists of between 160 million to 180 million Americans. These Americans, on average, Dave estimates pay between $300 to $400 per year in overdraft fees with their traditional checking account services. Dave's going to say, hey, you're financially vulnerable. I'm just kidding. That would be terrible marketing. No, they're going to say, you might spend more than $300 this year in overdraft fees. How about you come to us and spend $250, maybe even $200, whatever it takes. We'll figure out how to make you spend less than the bank is charging. And that's the competitive proposition here. That's Dave's business. So far, about 90% of its revenue comes from service-based revenue. And this is exactly what we just said, helping financially vulnerable Americans not overdraft their checking accounts. But the cool thing here is that as that grows, as more members come in, some are getting subscriptions, which I'm not going to talk about here, but you should definitely look into if you were a fan of Dave the business. Well, this just increases the chances that someone's actually going to use Dave's services, not just to avoid overdrafting, but maybe to do a transaction. I mean, the money's already in there. Maybe instead of taking that out, putting it to your traditional checking account and then doing a transaction, maybe you just do a transaction on Dave's platform. That is not Dave's bread and butter. In fact, it would be difficult for them to become as efficient in transactions as some of the larger banks. That really is a game of scale. But this is where the economic question is. What's more important for the financially vulnerable Americans? Is it economy of scale when they're doing transactions, or is it the network effect? And I'll leave you with these economic terms for you to look into yourself. But so far, it seems like the network effect is making it so that you join Dave in order to pay less in your overdrafting. Once the money's already there, you actually don't mind paying a little bit more to do transactions in the same account. And so right now it's about 10% of its revenue coming from transaction-based revenue, but it's growing very, very quickly, proving the fact that Dave, which is starting off with a really good idea, I mean, it is efficient at targeting the marketing to these financially vulnerable Americans, and then it's created a financial product that frankly is just straight up less expensive specifically for them. That's pulling people in. And now Dave is already at the point of proving that it can make tens of millions of dollars just on commission from the transactions going on. I mean, that's commission based off of hundreds of millions of transactions that it did last year. And this is they call it a flywheel in a lot of these executive meetings. This transaction revenue, there's no reason it won't continue to grow as financially vulnerable Americans become slightly less financially vulnerable, perhaps because they're paying less overdraft fees. That just leads to people tending to making more transactions the more money they have. Dave is well positioned to capture those transactions because it's the bank that helped a lot of these people escape overdraft hell, build up a bit of a financial cushion, and now they're creating transactions more like a regular non-financially vulnerable person. This is the latest annual report. If you're seeing the stock price move around for Dave, I almost guarantee you, which I don't often do, I usually say very little about animal spirits, but in this case for this company, if Dave escapes any real financial pain, escapes bankruptcy basically because of that financial covenant, I mean, that has a timer attached to it. Dave has until about mid-2024, which we have already passed, in order to accidentally fall into bankruptcy because of no reason other than that data breach, really. Well, at this point, if you're seeing the stock price move for Dave, it's because people were worried about that, the chances of that actually causing financial pain in the short term. Once that risk is eliminated, well, what you're left with is a very fascinating fintech that knows exactly what its core audience is and is really damn good at capturing that audience.